Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Melissa Eddy. Melissa is a journalist based in Berlin who covers German business, economics, and politics for the New York Times. She covered Chancellor Angela Merkel's time in office since 2005, before joining the International Herald Tribune, which is now the international edition of the New York Times, in 2015. She was a correspondent for the Associated Press in Frankfurt, Vienna, and the Balkans. And she is the author of the book, Merkel's Law, Wisdom from the Woman Who Led the Free World. And that's what we talk about. We talk about the general themes and profile of who Angela Merkel is and kind of what makes her tick a little bit. We talk about kind of the central feature of most of her time in office of gender and even specifics such as her particular fashion sense and her style that was pretty intentional. We also talk about her East German origins and how that factors into everything. We talk about her major achievements for the many years she was in office. We talk about some of the criticisms, her interactions with world leaders, her legacy, and many other topics. I've been very fond of Angela Merkel, as I can remember all of her time in office. And I certainly have some criticisms of my own, though. We talk about those. Either way, she was a very, very powerful figure, important leader for some important times, I'd say over the past decade and a half. So she's obviously a powerhouse, and Melissa did such a wonderful job with the book and was quite wonderful in the conversation. As always, you can find this conversation and all of the conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. You can also find me on YouTube, so like, share with your friends, subscribe, contribute, all those wonderful things. And now I bring you Melissa Eddy. I am here with Melissa Eddy. Melissa, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks. You and listeners will have to forgive me. I'm getting over a cold, and so forgive a little bit of the frogginess in my voice. Hopefully it's not too bad. Before we get into your book, which is called Merkel's Law, Wisdom from the Woman Who Led the Free World, about Angela Merkel, former Chancellor of Germany. I want to ask you all about it. Is this your first book, by the way?
It is my first book, yes.
Very nice.
I've written a lot of newspaper articles, but this was my first long-term project.
It was very well written. I mean, you can tell you write for a living. It's a great read. But before we get into it, just tell listeners kind of your background, kind of a snapshot of who you are, and kind of what got you in the space to write this book.
Okay, well, like so many things in life, it was kind of a fluke that I got where I am, which is in Germany. Talking to you from Berlin right now. And I wound up in Germany because after I graduated from university with a degree in English literature, I decided to go learn German. And everyone in my family and many of my friends thought this was a crazy thing to do. This was back in 1992. There was a lot of uncertainty in Germany at that time because we were still just right after the fall of the wall, post-reunification. And it was a whim. I had a friend who was German and said, "Oh, I've got a room you can stay, and why don't you come learn German?" And I did. And I happened to have this weird knack for the German language. I learned it relatively quickly, and it wound up shaping the course of my life because a few years later, when I decided I wanted to become a journalist, after I graduated from Columbia Journalism School, the Fulbright Association was putting together a new program for young journalists coming to Germany, and I put my hand up, and I came over here, and I got an internship with the Associated Press that led to a job with the Associated Press, that eventually, after 13 years there, led to a job with the International Herald Tribune, which 1 year later was folded into the New York Times. And now, more than 10 years later, I'm with the Times. Ironically, in pertaining to my book, I moved to Berlin. I was in Frankfurt when I first came to Germany for my job, and I moved to Frankfurt in 2005, several months before Angela Merkel became chancellor. And so I started covering Berlin politics in 2005. One of my first big stories was covering Merkel's win of the Chancellor Merkel becoming Chancellor, and I covered the entire tenure, all 4 of her terms in office.
Wow.
And I used to actually tell my kids, I'd be like, I've got a date with Merkel tonight, the babysitter's putting you to bed or whatever, just because it's weird when you're following politicians like this. They become, although you're not necessarily going out for a beer with them, they just become such a part of your life. And so I'm not personally close to Merkel, but I certainly spent a lot of time listening to her, thinking about her, and reporting on what she was trying to do or failing to do, depending on which day, which term we're talking about.
Yes, that's very, very nice. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm assuming you've met her. I mean, obviously you've interacted,
Yes.
With her, if you're, part of the press or things like that, or writing about her. But you've met her, I'm assuming, on a handful of occasions, or you've talked to her.
Yes.
Oh, very nice, very, very nice.
Yeah, and interviewed her as well.
Very nice.
She's a very private person. I get into this a little bit in the book.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
privacy is very important to her, and it meant that even with journalists, she had those who she really trusted, but the foreign press was never hugely important for her. And there's this crazy thing that the Germans do where they insist on controlling all of the quotes. So if you sit down for an interview, even if you're recording it, they demand that before they publish, they want to go over everything. And Merkel was known to go through with her red pen. And even if she told you something in a conversation, she might then say, no, actually, I don't want this to go to press yet, and retract it. And that goes against the policy of many, American journalism outlets, because the idea is we have a pact with our readers, we tell you what's happening, and we don't allow the politicians to control the conversation to that extent. So it did cause problems at times. But she was very famous for making sure that she had the final word in what her word was going to be that was going out to the public.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, this is a little bit different than how we do things here in the United States.
Yes.
So
very much so.
I guess give us a sort of, if you can. I find that many, figures, politicians, big figures, people that have some consequence on the world stage or in history, tend to be pretty elusive. They tend to be kind of a mystery of sorts. I don't know if there's something to that, but she's definitely somebody that is, for someone that was in the public eye for a long time. And again, it's not like she was a prime minister or chancellor of Gibraltar or Liechtenstein. I mean, nothing wrong with those countries, of course, but Germany is a powerhouse. It's one of the big countries in the European Union. Part of all the summits, the whole thing. So really front and center there with France and UK and the United States and so many other countries. What is it about her, if you were to try and kind of get like the pulse on her, on what makes her kind of tick? Many people will say this kind of pragmatic stability, how she governed for 16 years, whatever it is. But maybe a kind of rebranding of Germany in the modern era. But what's that kind of underlying ethos that kind of just drove her, at least as chancellor for 4 terms?
So, I mean, you touch on a lot of the key sort of Merkel themes there. The pragmatism was certainly one of them. And I think just to set the stage a little bit, something that I find is that from the United States, we often have tended to view Germany as sort of very close to the Nordics and more socially liberal, when in fact the Catholic Church has a long history in Germany, and Germany is quite a conservative country. And women had to fight very hard, at least in West Germany, right, where we come into this whole East-West divide.
Yeah.
Merkel, of course, coming from the East, where women were expected to work, but we can get into that later, talking about women. But so in this country where you tended to have very dominant male figures who tended to be very sort of egotistical and very focused on themselves and their own power. Merkel, she was powerful and she understood power and she understood how to get power and wield power as a politician. But she approached power in the idea of service. So she said very early on when she was elected to the head of her party, I want to serve the party. And then when she became chancellor, she said, I want to serve Germany. She didn't view her role as being about her as I am Angela Merkel and I'm the best thing for Germany. She saw it more as I am Angela Merkel, I have been given this position and this is what I can do for Germany. Which gets us into vision, which she was often, the biggest criticism of her was often that she lacked a vision. But this very down-to-earth, pragmatic approach, I think it just surprised a lot of people. The other thing that Merkel was really known for was consensus. She always sought consensus, whether it was at the European table, whether it was within her own coalitions. She governed for 3 of her 4 terms in office with the other major power in Germany. So like it was across the aisle-ism, if you will, in a way that in the United States today is totally unthinkable. And she ushered in this era of that, which also gave Germany stability. And Merkel was very much about stability. And the one thing you have to keep in mind, again, is that when we think of Germany as being around forever, and it's actually, Germany as we know it today was formed in 1990.
Yeah.
It is an incredibly young country. It has deeper roots in its east and in its west, particularly in its west and before the World Wars. But the construct of the Germany that Angela Merkel came into power and took over when she came into power is a very young country, and it had been through a lot of upheaval and a lot of turbulence. So having somebody just come in and really represent stability was, for the Germans at that time, a very big deal.
Yeah, I mean the history of Germany is very, very interesting, at least in the modern era. I mean, you have obviously 1871 that gets you up to World War II, really, and then you have after the war the split, 40 years east-west, and then you have fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification, and so the modern era is 30 years or so. So in a lot of ways, Germany is very much a very young country in some sense, at least in a modern sense. So it is interesting how I think she's still right. She's just the second longest serving chancellor. There's someone before her. I think that gets 18 some years.
Helmut
She's got
Kohl.
16. Yeah.
Yeah,
She gets 16.
Who was her mentor, right?
Right.
So it's actually quite interesting. And he oversaw the transition, the unification of East and West Germany with great help from the Americans, which Merkel always remembered. Merkel, with George Bush Sr., she credited him in many ways for giving her the gift of her freedom, because it was the Americans who convinced many of the other more skeptical partners, particularly Margaret Thatcher, who famously said, 2 Germanys are better than one. And so Merkel remained very much informed, and the way that she ruled was very much informed by this idea also that a system can collapse.
Yeah.
I think, in if you think of, the United States right now and all the upheaval and the political upheaval we're seeing in the past, what are we going on now? Like, let's just say decade?
Yeah, about yeah.
Right? It's unprecedented in our modern memory. And Merkel was very aware always that democracy is not a given. And she knew life without it for almost more than half of her life. And therefore, it was a cause that was incredibly close to her heart and extremely important to her, which she, especially in her final term, talked about far more often. I mean, things were also beginning to shift more in Germany there. Post-COVID, we were seeing political splits. Also, the ramifications of the 2015 immigrant situation.
Yeah.
But Merkel was definitely a chancellor who was informed by that very recent history, and really cherished the idea of like keeping things solid.
Yeah. You're really expanding on, I think a lot of people think of the Germans as, very pragmatic, very efficient, and sure, maybe that's a true stereotype of sorts. But when we say this about Merkel, it's well, how is it different from maybe just being kind of the stereotypical German? And you're kind of illustrating that there of understanding systems, can't take them for granted. What was her kind of mentorship? What is kind of her life story, and understanding all these things, I think is probably baked in there of sorts and into her formation. So obviously the big piece that you kind of hit straight away in the book is her gender, which is interesting because I don't really care about all of these popularity polls. Was she the most influential woman in the world at some point? Beat Hillary Clinton out a few times, or maybe some other people, or Michelle Obama, I'm not sure. But
she owned the Forbes most popular woman or most powerful woman
right.
list for years.
Yeah. I guess there's this interesting push-pull, right? Because she wasn't this very outgoing, I'm a champion for feminism, and yet she wouldn't entirely downplay it either. It sounds like there was a kind of sort of playing both sides of it here, which I can imagine is difficult. And again, as you said, Germany is pretty male dominated. It has a lot of conservative elements to it. So there's a kind of balancing act there. Yeah, tell us about how she kind of straddled being a woman in power and not only being a woman in power of Germany and its history, but as I mentioned before, a central country and nation state in the EU and just around the world. And we'll talk later about some of her interactions with different types of characters in the world stage. But yeah, tell us about this element of being a female leader in the world.
Well, it's really, for me personally, it was part of what made her so attractive coming, from the United States of America. It's interesting. We have so many women in positions of power in business, and we did have Nancy Pelosi, but we've never yet had a woman president. And I can remember Geraldine Ferraro, and what a big deal that was even at that time. And so to be in Germany and see a woman in power, it was sort of expecting there to be this huge revolution and sort of women on the streets thing. And in a way, in sort of true Merkel fashion, she kind of underplayed that element. She was very reluctant to be called a feminist.
Yeah.
In fact, she famously sort of said on the world stage, it was she had convened in 2017 a group of women leaders. You had women from around the world coming in, and she was asked point blank, "Are you a feminist?" And she said, "No, I cannot decorate myself with those feathers," was the turn of phrase she used.
Well, why did she push against this? I guess I think of another German, Hannah Arendt, and again, I'm not comparing the two, but she also kind of had this similar approach. Like, look, I don't want to be adorned with that title. I just want to be a thinker. Don't even put me in
Right.
Don't even call me a philosopher. Like, I want to be a thinker. Like, what is it about this sort of resistance for Angela?
I think it was about a couple of things. First of all, because Germany is so male-dominated still to this day
Sure.
in politics, I think she didn't want to shine a light on the fact that she was different. Her approach to power was, you're a leader, I'm a leader, our gender doesn't matter, what can we get done? And by trying to not highlight the gender issue, I think she felt that she had more power because she would be taken not as a woman leader, but as a leader. And that she didn't want her gender to matter. And you also have to remember about Merkel that had been her whole history growing up, right? She was incredibly good in math. She was a trained physicist. And so she had gone up through the university system where she was often the only woman in the room. So it wasn't new territory for her or to her. And I think her approach to figuring out how she could be recognized as a woman was to just be the best leader that she could be and not make it be about her gender, but let her gender speak for her itself. She was almost more of a like what don't follow what I say, follow what I do.
Right.
Was her approach to that. And I think feminism has become such a touchstone word that she didn't want to open this can of worms of being put in the box of, yes, I'm a feminist. Ironically enough, she later did, when Princess Maxima of the Netherlands said, well, a feminist is anyone who is for, women having equal rights. And Merkel said then, oh, okay, then I'm a feminist too, which is sort of funny that it took an Argentinian Dutch queen to open the door for Merkel to feel comfortable being a feminist. But certainly in Germany as well, the women who are known as feminists historically have been like the suffragettes, right? They're political stridents out on the street, really pushing for things.
Sure.
And she was much more of a behind-the-scenes tactician, playing her cards right, and she knew that being a woman was to her advantage. In fact, she famously said, I'm a double quota politician, because when Helmut Kohl was putting together his first government after the reunified elections following 1990, he needed to have representation from women, but he also needed to have representation from East Germans. And she knew she ticked two boxes in one individual. And so he could then, instead of having to hire two minorities, if you will, he had a 2-for-1 in her. And she was aware of that and was never ashamed of it, but she also did not want that to define her.
Yeah. It's very interesting because I think it's a kind of smart power, if you will. If you want to get things done and you want to do things, you have to, I think probably some people would criticize her a little bit of being like, well, you're kind of underplaying it a little bit, but more so along the lines of, yeah, but if you're getting things done, then you can truly be the model that you need to be with some substance. I guess just on that, she did do a lot of things for women's rights. I don't know if she was, having a megaphone in the streets telling all the things that she did in the name of feminism, but even for things like, I think her what is it her cabinet or whatever, her staff had, kind of equal parity by the end there, and a lot of changes. You have some elements of healthcare and other elements for I don't know if it's for maternal leave and for childcare. I guess on terms of what she oversaw in terms of policy changes or things like that, in between 2005 and 2000, what was it? 20, when did she leave? 21? 21, yeah. What could you say was different for women in Germany in 2021 from 2005, right? Like there were some things that she did for women's rights in Germany, no?
There were, yes. And they tended to be, as you say, things that she was not, championing the megaphone, but she made sure that they were happening. She also put women into positions of power to make then changes. For example, you mentioned parental leave. When she started, there was no parental leave open for fathers, and she changed that. She also shortened the time that women got full compensation, or the highest possible compensation for their maternal leave, not because she didn't want them to have it, but in order to make it easier for them to return to the workforce, because previously to that, you would see that women, if they had 2 children, they would be out of the workforce for nearly a decade. I also like to think of it kind of like what we saw with Obama, which is once you had a Black president, you couldn't think that ever again was not possible, because it had happened. It was possible. And with Merkel, it was the same situation. Once a woman had been chancellor, suddenly when the campaign was starting up of who was going to replace her, there was a debate that there were not enough women running, which before Merkel had run in 2005, before her very first term in office, no one would have dreamed of thinking it was unusual that there were not women running for chancellor. And suddenly, 16 years later, the idea that there weren't enough women running for chancellor was an issue to be debated. And so I think that was a real sea change socially. In terms of policy, she also made sure she oversaw legislation that ensured that boards have a certain level of representation of women in them as well. And she a lot of it was in her social policies that she oversaw. Seeing women being able to rise up in the military. She put in the first woman as a defense minister again, which was beforehand unheard of, and she championed other women in positions of power and made sure that they also had visibility. She also took the backs of women who were coming under fire for things that maybe had not, that she thought was not necessary. She herself had been through that. When she was first in office, there were loads of articles about her hairstyle. She had this page boy haircut. Everybody thought it was terrible. And in fairness, once she became chancellor, she got a stylist. She came up with a hairstyle. She would always have her professional makeup artist. But she made it so that her hairstyle was no longer talked about. And when there was a woman who followed her, the woman who became Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, a member of the Greens Party who ran for chancellor, nobody wrote about what Annalena Baerbock looked like unless it was a style magazine complimenting her on her dresses. And when Merkel was running, it ran the gamut of what her East German Jesus sandals, her long skirts. Merkel also put the kibosh on some of that discussion by coming up with her own style decision. She went with her colored blazers and black pants. And that was it. She kind of made that her uniform. It was a suit, in the way a man would wear a suit and a tie. That was her suit. And that was it. She didn't monkey with, trying this or that. The one time she did, she wore a low-cut dress to the opening of the Oslo opera that she was invited to, and someone caught a picture of her getting out of the taxi, leaning forward straight down her décolleté, which that was then discussed in the press, and I will never forget her spokesman having to tell the German press corps, I refuse to discuss the chancellor's décolleté in this context, and just putting the kibosh on it. And I think it was one of the most memorable press conferences, but it was also, good on him, and that had changed. We weren't going to discuss Merkel's clothes anymore. That was into her second term, and it was a non-issue. And those are some of the changes that I think are more subtle, but that were quite profound. I felt as an American woman who had come to Germany and was shocked by some of the level of things that in the States you wouldn't discuss things like that. You couldn't have these discussions about women's clothes exclusively in a political article. And in the early 2000s, that was standard.
What's interesting about that is obviously there's been women in positions of power. There's been, again, presidents, prime ministers around the world. Something about Merkel, though, like developing her style. I mean, like I can see all of those blazers and the pants that she would wear. Like it became like almost like
the flat shoes.
Yeah, and
Merkel
the flat shoes.
Never wore heels. Never wore heels. No heels.
It's so almost iconic in some ways. She kind of created. This. I mean, you could love her or hate her. It doesn't matter. She just has this like very memorable. It's not anything novel per se. I mean, there are plenty of women that wear pantsuits and things like that. Like that's not a new thing. But it's just I don't know the way she did it, the way she carried herself. It became like a thing. Like this is like kind of an iconic thing, which is I don't know if she maybe intentionally tried to do that.
Anna Wintour,
it's crazy.
No, when Anna Wintour from Vogue was writing about Merkel's look, right? You knew, yes, it was a thing. Yes, it was intentional for sure. She found a tailor who had actually trained in New York City and then returned to Hamburg, and this woman was her blazer, and the cuts very rarely changed. The colors would change, and of course, later, especially later in her chancellery in the last 8 years, it was always, amongst those of us who were the Merkel watchers, we were trying to decode. Was there a color code? Black would be for very serious, fine, right? But when it was pale purple, what did pale purple mean? And she once said, actually, that yes, she has. It was much later. She was like, "Oh yes, I always am conscious of what color I am wearing."
Of course.
And pale blue was her, blue is her favorite color,
Yeah.
so pale blue would be what she was wearing. But it was interesting because every so often, she would show up in something and it would be, that's a new one, or
That was very
just
interesting.
because, you're looking at the same individual for 16 years. Her hair didn't change. The only thing that changed was the color of her blazers. So then you start, it's kind of like, with guys, it's like tie
Yeah, it's
signaling,
ties.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. The blue tie
right?
or
It's
the red
ties.
tie or whatever. Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And with Merkel, it was the jackets, and that was really, I guess there were necklaces changed a little bit. She had different stone necklaces,
Interesting.
but it was really, if you wanted to try and be like a Merkel decoder, you were clocking the color of the blazer.
So, tell us about the aspect. So we talked about the gender aspect. Tell us about, I guess, her. I guess you could say cultural aspect, I guess, or regional, I guess maybe is more accurate here about being East German. I mean, even to this day, there is a sort of thing in East and West, old East West Germany. There's unification, but there's still it wasn't that long ago that there was East West Germany, and there's still, I mean, currently so many people living, today that are were born or lived in East Germany, can remember that, or West Germany. I guess her being from East Germany, beyond the wall, to quote Katja Hoyer, how was that for her coming of age and all these things in her early career? I mean, for many folks, after unification, there was a thing of this, of having East Germans being involved and such. So, not only did she become the first female chancellor, but she was a female chancellor from old East Germany. So there's a lot of undercurrent there. So yeah, tell us about this background of being from East Germany.
I think it massively informed who she was, who she is, and how she led as a chancellor, and and her whole system of beliefs. She did, however, underplay her East Germanness to the same extent that she underplayed her femininity. Right? It was sort of no identity politics. And one just small side note: she was actually born in Hamburg. So in what was the former West, but her father, who was a Lutheran pastor, felt that he was called to preach to the people in the East, where, of course, the socialist government was not very keen on the church. They wanted their system to be the only system that people believed in. So the Lutheran Church, in particular, in East Germany, was actually a kind of a hotbed of political dissent. And her father was certainly hosting some of these, illegal well, they weren't illegal, but they weren't supposed to be happening, right? They could happen in the confines of on the church grounds, but where they were discussing different politics and were not maybe necessarily 100% behind what the government at the time, the East German government, wanted them to be believing in. And so that certainly, she grew up very keenly aware and in a household that was very political, just by the nature of all this. She also, because she was from the church and the government didn't like the church, she knew that she was being spied on continually, and she was schooled as a little girl not to talk about what went on at home. For example, in East Germany, a lot of time you would watch West or hear West, and that meant you were watching West German television or radio to get your news, which you were getting a very different take on the world from what you were getting from the East German. And so she knew that you didn't, if the teacher asked, who here, what, does this or that, to be always aware, to have your guard up. And that awareness kind of informed her as a person. It was part of her obsession with privacy. And she remained very fiercely protective of her personal life. She was not a politician that was going to pose for pictures in her home with her family. That's rarely done in Germany anyway. But for Merkel, it was just absolutely unthinkable because of this. She also was very, as I mentioned a bit earlier, she really was very aware of democracy and of what a gift democracy was, because she said she became a scientist. She wanted to become a teacher, but she became a scientist because she said if you became a teacher, you were open to the political whims of the system. And she said, the facts of science, right? The laws of physics cannot be changed by a government. They are what they are. And so she was very drawn to this idea of sort of a straight line, if you will. But in her approach to government, and especially in the post-COVID or during COVID, when we saw democracy really starting to weaken and faith in institutions really starting to weaken, she became a much more adamant defender of democracy and of the importance of these democratic institutions that had been set up after World War II, because she believed that they had given her a whole new lease on life. The fact that the Berlin Wall fell and she was able to enter into politics and take on this amazing role was something that she remained deeply, deeply grateful for. At the same time, it must be said that a lot of other East Germans didn't have the fairy tale ending of the fall of the wall. The wall fell, their jobs became redundant, they went on unemployment, and towards the end of her tenure, when she was finally talking about being proud to be East German and that East Germans are maybe not always given equal weight in the German discussion, a lot of East Germans by then were already very angry that she had not done more to promote their cause, to ensure equality parity of East Germans and West Germans in different institutions and in different aspects of life. And every politician has the things that they didn't see coming or that they didn't do right, or where maybe they have a regret. I don't know if she regrets it, but certainly one could say one of her oversights was failing to really take into account the sense of disenfranchisement that many people from the former East had within reunified Germany, and how profoundly different their experiences of losing the East German state were to her own.
You're kind of showing that there's a lot of maybe spoken, but a lot of unspoken or pressure on her in so many ways, as a woman, as someone from East Germany, as someone that was there for a long time. So this idea of building consensus, but she also has, like any head of state, all of these issues. And I think it was Obama who said that, I think this, if I remember correctly, is this right? I could be wrong on this. During the crisis in Greece, he was like, listen, I can't even get my own party together. She's got to get all of Germany in a coalition and the EU. That's a very, again, it's not just her, but she was pivotal for the crisis in Greece. And so, but then there's all these other pressures, right? All these other pressures of, well, you got to do this and make sure you do this and make sure, this way. Tremendous, right? It just, you can, again.
Leadership is complicated, right?
It's a lot of things, but especially for Germany, so recently after, 91, 92, and then, the EU, and really trying to have good stability. Of course, the economic crash in 2008, was impacted the world, and then there's the pandemic in 2020. So just a lot of things that she hit, and many other things in between. I do want to ask, what would you say? You don't talk about it at extensive length, but I am curious though, for someone that served for so long, what would you say are kind of the centerpieces of her tenure as chancellor? We talked about healthcare. You can elaborate on that healthcare system, but how was she on economic issues? I know that she's had some criticism of that in her fourth term on some of the economic things. How she handled various crises or not. We can talk about some of the critiques in a minute, but what are when history looks back on Angela Merkel's 16 years as Chancellor of Germany, what's going to be those like 3 or 4 big, this is the thing that she just did, like with here in the US, you can pick certain presidents that, there's, LBJ for civil rights, and there's FDR for, saving the economy and helping to beat, Nazis, Obama had healthcare, whatever it is. What would be her kind of big flagship things?
So her big flagship things I mean, under her watch, the German economy grew by 34%. She really oversaw a tremendous period of prosperity. Unemployment went from 11% when she took office to 4% when she left. And I would say overseeing that period of prosperity will definitely be one of the landmarks of her time. Now, I have to also add that she gets a lot of criticism for failing to use that, which if we want to get into criticism in a minute, we can happy to expand on that more. She pulled Germany out of nuclear power.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Which in the outside, Americans actually think is crazy. For the Germans have this bananas fear of nuclear energy. And so domestically, it was a very big deal that will reverberate.
Sure.
Those are two of like the biggest domestic things. On the European stage, it was her ability to hold the euro together at a time that it was crumbling. Again, opened her up for a lot of criticism. The Greeks, Southern Europeans, to this day, are not fans of Merkel. Even Obama thought that she was and Germans were far too harsh. But she managed to hold it all together. But I would say the biggest landmark, without a doubt, was her decision in 2015 to keep the borders open when you had more than 1 million people marching into Germany. And that also has opened her up for a lot of criticism. But at the time, it was a landmark decision. And a lot of what informed it was her fear that if Germany were to turn back refugees, if Germany were to, that the only way it could be done was with force. And if Germany were to turn all of its force on the innocent masses, again, that history would be repeating itself in a way that she did not want to be responsible for. And so at the time, amongst liberals, it was extremely well received. And it also showed a softer side of Germany, because Germany, if you think about it, for years and years and years, is just associated with Nazis, especially in the American mindset, certainly in a lot of Hollywood movies. Obviously, the whole Nazi period, although it was short, is rich territory for stories.
Yeah.
But this marked Germany. And under Merkel, that changed. Suddenly, Germany was not only associated with Nazis, and there were Germans who felt that for the first time they were, in their living memory, they were on the right side of history. They had done the right thing by choosing the friendly face over the use of force.
Okay, so let's talk about
complicated.
Let's talk about 2015. I guess then this is my biggest, again, as an American across the pond. I get the kind of charitable view here on this. I do get that, and I can remember that time specifically. I know these were a lot of Syrian refugees.
Yes.
And I believe a lot of Turkish folks as well. And there's a lot of different people from the Middle East that were coming to Germany. And again, I'm sympathetic to these challenges. I guess the biggest criticism I have, and I think that many people have, is how much in a short amount of time, and a lot of it unchecked, I guess, is because
all of it was unchecked initially. Yeah.
And
that was the criticism.
Yeah,
right?
because that's a lot. It's a lot of
It was
people.
Also, it was a loss. It's a lot of people, and it was a loss of control. At the time, even domestic critics, those people within the domestic security system said, we do not know who we are letting into the country. And that proved to be true. And it was predominantly Syrians, right? Because you had ISIS raging in Syria. You had this conflict. There were a lot of Afghans.
Yeah.
Afghans who were in Iran. They heard this was happening, and they joined the show. You also had people from Tunisia, the Middle East. People were just were pouring into the country, and it was a huge risk. Merkel's stance was that we are such a wealthy country. We have managed challenges in the past. We can manage this one. And from the vantage point of today, where immigration in Germany is as hot of a debate as it is in the United States.
Of course.
We have state elections going on in Eastern Germany. The Eastern Germans are on the border, where you've got a lot of people coming across. The debate is still going on. It has not stopped, and we're nearly a decade later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my concern of this at the time, and I think a lot of people's concern, was the downstream effect of this, right? It's an economic concern, it's a safety security concern, but it's also, I know some people kind of, grimace at this, but it is an assimilation concern as well, right? Of sorts, where you have people from very different parts of the world with different religious affiliations, different cultural affiliations. They're not Lutherans, right? Or they're not Catholics or whatever, right? A lot of these people, some maybe, but, and it is different. And, Germany is a big country, but it's not the U.S. big. It's not, China or Russia big. I mean, it's not that big. It's not that huge. And I guess the other piece of it is it's a major European Union country, and having to deal with, again, all of these things that come with a person, right? What is their their papers? How are they integrating into things in terms of jobs and schools and getting treatment and things like this? Is, that's a kind of pragmatic thing, aside from all of the kind of, cultural integration things and such. And so immigration is always something that is a hot, button issue for really a lot of countries, many countries. And I guess there is a kind of downstream effect, because you do see some economic downturn in Germany now. You do see some immigration challenges, and you are seeing various alternative parties that are more right, more extreme, that are, I mean, this is just, this is like free points, it's just say, well, look all this and look at all this, look what this party did. It's, again, I always think that each country has its own unique kind of things and challenges, but you can see some similarities to other countries in the world, including the US, about this kind of marriage of sorts, or wanting to marry immigration with some sense of nationalism, healthy or unhealthy as it is. And I mean, this has to be seen as, maybe at the time it was a sort of success of sorts, but I think the way in which it was done, I mean, to me, is a pretty big glaring error on her part at the time. And maybe for herself or for other people would say not at all, but it does seem like it is maybe we could have done this a little bit differently. Maybe not as many people. Maybe we could have checked things a little bit better. Maybe we could have spread this out over time, or I don't know. Maybe there could have been a better way of doing it, but just the way in which it was done, I think most people had criticisms. I don't know. What do you think on this? Am I totally off on this? Where am I wrong here?
Well, no, you're not totally off. It has certainly proved to be, and which is why it will be her biggest legacy, right? One of the most divisive issues and decisions that she made whatsoever. On the pro, in her defense, it must be said that Germany actually needs migrants. It has a shrinking workforce. It's got jobs that it cannot fill.
Older population.
It's an older country.
Yeah, that's true.
So the idea that immigrants could help fill that is certainly valid, but not all of the immigrants that were walking across the border were the skilled laborers that Germany might be looking for. And a lot of them were single young men from a very different socialization, countries and cultures where, although they revered a woman in power for having made this decision, they themselves were not very keen on following women in power, right? Like you had female teachers in schools that would have trouble with kids. Schools were another thing. It put a tremendous strain on schools. It put a tremendous strain on communities. And then there's also the security issue, where we had a series of different attacks carried out in the name of Islamists. There was a guy with an axe on a train. There was a guy who tried to blow up a market square in Bavaria. Then there was the truck attack on a Berlin Christmas market. And all of these instances had links to the decision to leave the border open. So yes, it was definitely one of the most controversial. And could she have handled it better? I'm sure she could have, right? Like the problem, however, that you have to keep in mind about immigration for Germany, which is different from the United States, is that immigration is actually a European Union issue. So the individual countries can't handle these cases necessarily on their own. And you had Italy and you had Greece that were already completely overrun and for more than a year had been just like waving flags trying to get the attention that we've got too many people, we cannot take any more, this is crazy. And then by the time they would make it up to Germany, technically under existing EU law at that time, Germany would have the right to send them back to the countries that they entered in. But the countries that they entered in, Italy and Greece in many cases, were so overwhelmed, they simply couldn't take anymore. So the whole European system is broken. And Merkel, who held such power at the EU level, although she was only the German chancellor, probably could have done a lot more at the EU level to come up with an EU-wide solution, which is eventually what she did when she, about a year and a half after we had all, because the influx of 1 million people took place from 2015, 2016. And then she did this deal with Turkey, where the European Union paid Turkey effectively to set up and host these refugee camps for the Syrians, keeping them closer to their home border so that they would later be allowed to return. Something like that should have and could have been done much earlier, but it took the crisis in order for there to be any kind of a solution, because that solution took the pressure not only off Germany, it took it off everybody within the EU, which meant that other EU partners that had been sort of like, Germany, you're the biggest, you got the biggest economy, you deal with these people, felt like they were not getting any help.
Yeah, you make some good points there. Of course, it's now continued to be Turkey's challenge, and Turkey has a myriad of issues, and there's obviously...
Right, which was what her critics said, which was like, you've thrown these poor people to the wolves, you've sent them to Turkey, which has a myriad of issues.
Yeah.
Immigration is really complicated. It's one of the biggest issues facing the whole world today. The other thing that Merkel did quite quietly, though, on the immigration front, was she started looking very closely at Africa, under the idea that people were going to be coming from Africa to Europe, and if they were to stay in Africa, then maybe the Europeans needed to spend more time investing in their lives in Africa and trying to promote better living standards on the ground so that they wouldn't come. And in her final term in office, she actually spent quite a bit of time, and Germany diverted quite a bit of funds and resources towards this. It's one of these things, though, that is not going to be, she was not going to live out the chancellor. She was not going to be in office when that was, whether it worked or not, right? Where the answer to that came down. But again, these are issues that could have been addressed much, much earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That would have prevented the crisis that eventually hit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a tough thing to deal with. And again, there's just so many variables, but on the face of it, I mean, just completely unchecked across the board, just does with that many people is a lot. So tell me real quick, you mentioned it in the book at different points, so I just kind of string it together here. I'm just curious about this, which is how she handled, as she's handling all these, crises, and she's dealing with all these things, she's got to deal with a lot of different actors, a lot of different characters on the world stage. On the U.S. side, she went from Bush to Obama to Trump, and then Biden, yes. And obviously a majority of that time was Obama because of the overlap there. Although she as you talk about in the book, and I've read elsewhere too, she was quite fond of W. Bush, and she's also dealt with Putin for a very long time, even before being chancellor. So Putin's been there forever in Russia, and then obviously Erdogan in Turkey, and very nearby, and many other folks in France and Italy and the UK and Spain. How does she handle all of these different types of heads of state throughout time? And we're talking, again, a decade and a half, and many people come and go. How was she able to kind of navigate and balance, be who she is, but then know how to deal with the different types of personalities. I mean, you can maybe bring up Obama and Putin since they're kind of, big at the time, but you can bring up other characters as well if you want.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start with
Yeah.
with George W.
Yeah.
Bush, because there was the famous back rub where it
Yes.
was when, right? Everyone, you say the back rub, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah," we could see the picture of him kind of. It looks like he's sneaking up behind her. She's just not used to it, and giving her like a rub on the shoulders,
Right.
and she sort of jumps and grimaces. But the ironic thing of that relationship is that they seemed to be two just profoundly different people, and yet she used a skill that she always uses, which was she informed herself, who is this guy and how can I connect to him?
Mm-hmm.
And when her aides told her, George W. Bush is a very religious man, she was like, right, well, I grew up a pastor's daughter. I know religion. So she would approach him initially talking about elements of his faith, and was able to find a way in with him with that. He also, I think, had the credit of being a Bush because, as I said earlier, she credited his father with ensuring the reunification of Germany. So then when he left office, Obama comes in. And I will never forget standing in front of the two of them, or sitting in front of the two of them at their first press conference. Each of them are behind a lectern, and each of them looked incredibly stiff and miserably uncomfortable with one another. And the atmosphere in the room was so cool that you needed to put your scarf on in order to warm it up. And everyone thinks of Merkel and Obama as this great friendship, which after 8 years, it was there. But initially, she thought he was kind of aloof and arrogant, and who is this young whippersnapper coming in here? If you remember, when he was campaigning as a senator, he wanted to give a speech at the Brandenburg Gate.
Yeah.
He was looking to burnish some of his foreign policy chops. He came over to Berlin, wanted to speak at the
200,000 people came over there, right? More than for anybody. It's a massive amount of people.
A massive amount of people, yeah. The Germans are obsessed with American politics, almost more than Americans are obsessed with their politics, which is kind of a shame since we're the ones who vote. It's intense over here as well.
It's funny.
But anyway, yes, some 200,000 people showed up, but they did not show up to the Brandenburg Gate because Merkel famously said no. The Brandenburg Gate is reserved for heads of state and heads of government to speak at, not for upstart senators. So she sent him down to the Victory Column, which was, if you will, in Berlin's main boulevard, mile down the road. And he filled that up. And that's, it's got spokes coming in, streets coming in from different sides. So it was actually better because you could pack more people in there, and they turned up. And some of her aides said she was a little jealous of that because at that time,
I mean, who wouldn't be?
Merkel, right? Merkel couldn't turn out 200,000 people in the center of Berlin.
I can't think of any head of state anywhere around the world, if they were to come into, New York City, Los Angeles, DC, Chicago, wherever you want, and bring in 200,000 people. I can't think of anybody that would do that here in the U.S. It's pretty wild, actually, if you flip it.
And in Germany, also unheard of. And so, she was like, who is this guy? Of course, 8 years down the road, she famously hosted him at the Brandenburg Gate and let him speak there. By that time, they were great friends.
Yeah.
But it really took Obama's second term in office and the two of them getting to know each other. And he gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of her contributions to democracy. And that really touched her. I mean, in terms of, soft skills, he kind of knew how to get her. And boy, she just kind of melted at that one.
I mean,
because here she was thinking, right, she was going to have to be a retired East German lady before she even got to see the United States. And suddenly here she is standing in the Rose Garden being lauded by the president, receiving, the country's highest civilian honor.
Yeah.
And that was a real turning point. So, but also she recognized that the two of them shared a couple of things. One, they were both kind of outsiders in their political spheres, right? That he was the first Black African-American, first Black guy, first Black president in the States, had kind of come up from, a different background. We've gone over her own thing. They had that, but also they thought a lot alike. Very analytical, very into the details. going into the deep into the weeds, into the the data, the thick folders. Merkel was known for coming over-prepared. She always would be the best prepared person in the room. That was one of her strategies, to never be caught off guard on anything. And so she really appreciated that in Obama. And then I'm going to go just real quickly to Biden. Biden was like a great transatlanticist. The Germans are super into the transatlantic relationship, so that relationship was pretty smooth sailing. Trump was a whole nother kettle of fish.
Yeah.
Merkel didn't know what to make of Trump initially, but she pretty quickly figured out that he belonged kind of into the same category of the Putins, of the Erdogans. He was one of those guys.
Yeah.
And her approach for dealing with those guys was certainly to over-prepare and to have sort of, clear expectations and arguments going in, and but also seeking to maintain conversation. She refused to cut off conversation with Putin even after 2014, when there was a lot of talk about it. She lobbied hard for Brussels against her many German companies that did not want to impose sanctions on Russia. She went incredibly hard for imposing sanctions on Russia, but at the same time, she kept talking to Vladimir Putin because she believed you keep talking to them no matter what. That people like that leaders with tremendous egos and with questionable beliefs are far more dangerous when they're isolated than when you're in conversation with them.
Yeah.
And coming back to Trump, I think she was shocked that the American public had elected someone with so little policy and political experience. It was, many Germans were, it was something they had a hard time understanding, but she went out of her way to make sure that he understood. And this was in her first, when she congratulated him on winning the presidency. She said, by the way, she made it very clear in her speech, I will be happy to work with you on the terms of mutual respect and respect for democratic institutions on which our countries and our foundations have been built, because she already was thinking ahead of what was this guy potentially going to be doing, going to be thinking. She also tried very hard to get him to read and to engage him with some of the facts that she was interested in, like when he was threatening tariffs against the German auto industry. She brought watered down bullet point documents, like spelling out these German automakers are contributing this much money to the American economy, where they're supplying this many American jobs, and he was not interested in reading it.
I'm sure he loved that. I'm sure him having a strong woman telling, pedantically. I mean, maybe she came from a good place, but I'm sure he did not receive that well.
But so her approach just came to be, sticking to her guns. She was always polite. She never she remained very unflappable. She always held herself together. The only thing that we saw, and we didn't see this with Putin, it was sort of a Trump specialty, was her facial expressions. She would have the eye roll, right? And she kind of let her face do the talking. And by that point, she was late enough in her chancellorship that she was like, she wasn't going to take anything.
Yeah.
And so she made it clear, if you were watching, it wasn't the Blazers that were signaling. You didn't even have to try to decode colors. It was completely obvious on her face what she was thinking.
Yeah.
And with Putin, it was much more of she had grown up in a system where KGB spies were present, and were determining elements of her life. She knew exactly what that guy was capable of, and she just refused to let him get the better of her.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of her approach to many leaders. And it was interesting. It was only later in her final term of office that she would start pushing back a little bit. Like, she was in Israel, and she was invited by Netanyahu to this meeting of business leaders, and she looked around the table and she's like, not many women here. Hope next time I come to see a few more. Merkel, in her early days, would have never said something like that.
Yeah.
So she became a little bit more direct the longer she stayed in office, but she refused to let anyone push her buttons. And if they pushed them, she wouldn't let them see that they had been pushed.
So final question here is, obviously it's kind of a big question, but what do you think is the legacy of Angela Merkel, and how do you think that's going to grow of sorts over time as she's further out from it? And in addition to that, what is something that from your perspective, on your side, you would want listeners to know about her that most people wouldn't know? You covered her for a long time. You were close to these things, like, all these events, all of her whole chancellorship. What's something that I guess folks don't know, whether it's connected to legacy or not, about her that they should know, that you might not read in a book, or you might not hear in a speech, but something that, kind of closer, you kind of get, like, this is more of the essence of her. So yeah, kind of legacy piece of it, and then something about her that maybe we don't really always hear about or know.
Legacy piece is always tricky, because when Merkel left office, we saw Ukraine blow up. And so Merkel had worked very hard to reach a compromise to stop the conflict in Ukraine, and she failed. And we've already been over the immigration element. I think that will definitely be a legacy, and that has yet to fully play out.
Yeah.
It's really going to take a generation to see how right or wrong that was. But we're already seeing the effects of her decision to turn off nuclear energy meant that Germany had less energy when the Russians pulled the plug on natural gas that Germany needed. And so, unfortunately, some of her decisions are not looking great in terms of policy. However, there is this sort of softer, more positive legacy of she ushered reunited Germany into a new state in the minds of the world, and shifted the way that Germany is viewed in many people's minds, from being, the dangerous big hegemon to being the largest economy in Europe that is, in a way, just like a normal country, which sounds really boring, but for the Germans, to be a normal country is kind of a big deal.
Yeah. No. I totally agree with you on that. I think that there's trying to rebrand from Nazi Germany, which, people still talk about, it still is on, but getting that to be like, yeah, but that was before. And Germany now, when we look at that, it's not that anymore. Like, yeah, that's more, It's becoming further in history. And obviously we shouldn't forget our history, of course, but it's not, that Germany isn't just that, right? That it's more than that, which is, yeah.
And totally rebrand is a good way to put it, because it's very much that she really, that happened under her watch.
Yeah.
And her personality and her presence was essential to that. So, but again, as was very much dominant throughout Merkel, is, I think, in the world's eye, and her legacy on the international stage will be more positive than what her domestic legacy will probably be.
Yeah.
What people do not know about Merkel is that she has this unbelievable sense of humor. She is hilariously funny. She doesn't let it show in politics, but it comes out in private. She has an incredible, dry, witty sense of humor she's smart and she's quick-witted, and if you get her in private, which unfortunately I've never been able to, like, go out in one of her girls' night of drinkings, that she would go and get a glass of wine with some of her political mates. But I'm told there's a lot of laughter, a lot of jokes, and she's actually also in her terms in office, she could be an incredible mimic of some of the other politicians that she dealt with.
Oh,
but
that's great.
She never let that get too far out of the private sphere.
It's very, very, very fascinating. Well, Melissa, this is a fantastic conversation about a very important, consequential figure in the more recent years, definitely the 21st century. I greatly appreciate you coming on and talking to us all about Angela Merkel. And I look forward to all the other stuff that you're putting out and all the pieces you're putting out and any other books you may put out in the future. So big thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Absolutely.